This is a response to MSB 767's request for perspectives on George W. Bush. Before I begin, I will issue a warning that I may become somewhat metaphysical in this response. I know that MSB has said that he is an atheist. My intent is not to change his perspective on this. I do not feel that I have the right or the ability to control the beliefs of another person. I would only humbly request that MSB allow me to keep my own beliefs also. They have been in the process of developing over the course of several years, and I find that in the process of refining them, I develop new perspectives which help me deal with some of the things that are currently occurring in the world. In hearing my response, MSB, if it makes it easier, I would ask that you view it as a hypothetical scenario or speculative model rather than any absolute truth. I am not omniscient, and do not know all in this case, or in any. Therefore this perspective will only be a construct based on that knowledge which I do have. The second observation we will make is that this is a very complex issue. It is, so to speak, a very large question that is being asked. George W. Bush, as the current leader of the American government, is an individual whose purpose by necessity touches a vast number of disparate elements of human life, including many which may not initially be immediately obvious. In the past, I had exactly the type of purely emotional negative perspective on George W. Bush which you have stated that you do not want in response to your video. However, I have since been exposed to additional information, and therefore made the choice to change my perspective. The reason why I will refer to my spiritual beliefs in relation to this topic is because in talking about George W. Bush, it is necessary to speak of causes, and those of us who believe in a spiritual element to the universe also often believe that spirit is the domain of causes. More specifically, however, to talk of George W. Bush is to talk of human perceptions about the causes of certain major recent events, rather than the actual causes themselves in any objective sense. I believe MSB that you were able to perceive this yourself when you requested that people only engage in this discussion with you with reason rather than emotion. As a singular human being, like the rest of us, George W. Bush is not, and cannot, be held to be wholly personally responsible for everything that occurs on this planet. He may be held accountable only for his own choices, and I would warn anyone that in judging him, it may prove very difficult to know which choices were his, and which were made by others working with him. As it has been said, the American presidency is an institution, not a singular individual. I believe myself that George W. Bush's purpose, when related to the larger overall collective of humanity, is positive. It is acknowledged that this statement is a judgment, and although it is not one that is intended to be negative, it is also acknowledged that this judgment is not one which, strictly speaking, we have the right to make. It is therefore made speculatively or hypothetically, in the awareness that a lack of understanding of this individual's purpose is the cause of much human suffering at the present time, and for the purposes of offering an explanation, in the hope that this explanation may help to alleviate this suffering. In those few people who hear these words, it is also necessary to point out that the positive nature of Bush's purpose may not be immediately apparent to the observer. Some of the individuals who are born in this world have a purpose which is positive in a very straightforward and obvious way. People who take nursing or firefighting as career choices, for example, or those who otherwise work with children who are burn victims or have terminal non-contagious diseases. It will usually be agreed that such individuals are contributing to the greater collective in an immediately visible and highly positive way. With other people, however, it can be somewhat different. If there is one thing that human beings have demonstrated, it is that most of the time, they will not attempt to correct problems within their psychology or belief systems when things are going well for them, or their environment is safe. They will usually only be willing to resolve harmful psychology or belief systems when they are endangered as a direct result of holding that psychology or belief system. Therefore, it becomes necessary for scenarios to be created where people are shown in a very stark and largely undeniable way what the negative consequences of continuing to refuse to change their belief systems or psychology will be. As it is said, spare the rod, and spoil the child. There are currently a lot of events occurring in the world which are not in line with what people have said they want. People have said that they do not want the war in Iraq, high petrol prices, international terrorism, and the general degree of apocalyptic fear and uncertainty that exists. Yet all of these things continue to exist regardless of what people have stated their desires to be. In understanding my personal theory behind George W. Bush's purpose, it is necessary to understand the paradox that exists between what people say they want, and what is actually occurring on the planet. Individuals have grown enormously accustomed to giving other people responsibility for a great many of their own affairs. In some cases this is referred to as delegation, and can be done without great harm resulting to the individual, who has abdicated responsibility. In other cases there is a scenario where people relinquish their sovereignty and responsibility to others, who do not have their well-being as the primary interest. When this occurs, and when the individual who has relinquished sovereignty is harmed as a result of that action, a lesson is offered. The lesson is that instead of having relinquished individual sovereignty, the individual in question could have made a decision or taken an action for themselves, rather than giving the responsibility for doing so to an individual who may be lacking in personal integrity. If the individual in question did this, they could ensure that whichever decision they were abdicating responsibility for, could be made in a way that was genuinely in harmony with their own well-being. I believe that George W. Bush's purpose is to assist in the education of large numbers of human beings, in relation to this principle. Many of the people in America and the rest of the world have traditionally handed responsibility for the functioning of the world in general off to their rulers, with the expectation that their rulers would look after them, in a manner not dissimilar to parents with children. We have seen that when placed in positions of absolute authority, parents can very often enormously abuse their positions of authority. We should then not be surprised that the same occurs with the rulers of a state, when the state's subjects, through fear, apathy, and inaction, give said rulers far more authority over their lives than said rulers should have. The larger, developmental purpose, then, not only of Bush as an individual, but of the current American government as an institution, is to create intensely painful scenarios in the lives of human beings, until said human beings make the decision to reclaim their own responsibility. People need to cease expecting politicians to always act on their behalf. Governments will only begin to consistently take constructive, beneficial actions when they are actively overseen by national populations who seek to proactively ensure that their needs are met. My own interpretation is that problematic administrations such as the current one in America exist in order to provide incentive to their populations to begin engaging in this process. Until this is done, my expectation is that the world will continue to experience ever-worsening problems. As an example, if people do not want the war in Iraq to continue, they should not merely perform ineffectual actions such as letter writing or making phone calls to politicians. A war requires soldiers to fight it. If said soldiers refuse to fight it, then the war by definition cannot occur. Although it has also been said that if individuals conscientiously object, that they will be jailed. If the larger body of the entire military were to do this, not all of them would be jailed at once. The key to successful conscientious objection, and therefore, what is likely to be the only effective means of the people to end the war, is for the majority of the military to refuse to fight simultaneously. In saying this, I do not wish to be mischaracterized or misunderstood. I am not a pacifist, or at least not in a blanket sense. I believe that there are times, or at least more specifically that there have been times, when war was the appropriate response. However, as Sun Tzu wrote on the subject, the sword is only to be employed sparingly, with discernment, and must always be put away again with great speed, lest it actually turn upon he who wields it. Iraq does not qualify for my own definition of a just war, however, as we are seeing, and I am attempting to explain here, from a developmental perspective, the war is still able to serve constructive purposes. We are continuing to see, in many other places and scenarios than merely America, a situation where power is held by a minority who are acting in direct opposition to the interests of the majority who they falsely claim to represent. This was actually the case with the proposed 7/7/07 as one gathering in New York. However, as this situation provided an example of the problem, it also provided an example of the solution. Other individuals within the YouTube community spoke up and expressed resistance and unhappiness with the attitudes displayed by the organizers of the original gathering, and as a result, an alternate gathering was arranged, which was apparently more in line with the majority's beliefs. This, then, is the service that I believe is offered to human society by George W. Bush. He is drawing attention to the lesson that if an individual or a country is being oppressed and abused, that in far more cases than is realized, said oppression is actually consensual on the part of the victim. Although it can sometimes initially be difficult, once the individual or country has made the decision that the oppression will not continue, and end to such oppression can come with surprising speed. The lesson is to realize that choice exists, where most believe that there is no choice. Most believe that the things which have happened in Iraq and America under Bush are things which they are powerless to cease, or to prevent. In many cases literally a statement of resistance on the part of a sufficiently large enough body of people, is all that is necessary to cause an oppressive act to cease. This has been seen many times in the past. Whether the instrument used to end an abusive act or series of acts is violent, as was the global resistance to Hitler, or passive, as was Gandhi's resistance to the British, is actually largely irrelevant, as my own belief is that either one of these responses can be appropriate, depending on the individual situation. The truly important thing is a recognition and exercise of the will to end the abusive act. The recognition that a choice can be made, and that the choice that will be made, is to end what is occurring. The real, core lesson here, is that every individual must ultimately become their own ruler. They must develop a willingness to acknowledge their own individual sovereignty. Men like America's current rulers only achieve power because they hold partial understanding of this principle, even if in their case the principle is applied in a primarily negative way. They have accepted and acknowledged their own sovereignty, and the realization that they are responsible for their own actions, but instead of having chosen to adopt an ethical center and work consciously for the well-being of the whole, they instead use the knowledge of their own sovereignty to exploit others, who are not yet likewise unplugged, to use the analogy of the Matrix. An analogy here from that film would be Cypher, who knew that the environment he was in was an illusion, but who, instead of wanting to leave it, wanted to rejoin it in a position of authority. However, what he could not foresee was that even while acting in this manner, he was inadvertently still continuing to serve the greater good. Thus, you can notice my initial statement that the purpose of George W. Bush was positive. I did not say that I believe his conscious intention was necessarily positive, and therein lies the crucial difference. The lesson that therefore is offered by Bush and other individuals like him is one that is of the utmost importance to human development. I used to believe that feelings of aggression and hostility were an appropriate response to him. However, I have since attempted to replace those feelings with a sense of gratitude. If the larger society are able to fully accept, learn, and integrate this lesson, the consequences would be enormous, and enormously positive.